Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. In 1925, for the hit musical revue Garrick Gaieties, songwriters Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart penned an iconic song entitled Manhattan, describing some of the city's simple delights for a young couple in love. The song begins with some delightful lyrics, fancifully declaring how lovely it is to romp through the Bronx Zoo. In her latest, the novel Deadfall, mystery writer Linda Fairstein also sets the stage in the Bronx Zoo. But what goes on in Deadfall is somewhat more suspenseful and less of a reverie than the Richard Rodgers and Hart song. With us to tell how she conceived of her heroine, roaming from New York landmark to New York landmark in search of the murderer of the New York County District Attorney, is the former head of the Sex Crimes Bureau in the New York County District Attorney's Office, now at the top of her game in her second career as a best-selling mystery writer. Linda Fairstein, we're thrilled to have you back on the show.
Jim, it's always a delight to talk to you. That's a very generous introduction.
Well,
quite
now,
clever.
You've reached the summit of eminence because you recently appeared on 60 Minutes.
Well.
Now, I want to ask you about that because Oprah said, remembering her first time on 60 Minutes, this was your first time on 60 Minutes.
Actually, it was Leslie Stahl, but it was for Sunday morning, CBS Sunday morning.
Well, it's the same kind of deal, but Oprah said if 60 Minutes comes a-calling and you haven't committed a crime, you don't get more breakout than that.
Totally,
So,
totally.
how did it feel? Did you get a breakout?
I had a huge breakout. First of all, people love those Sunday shows. Sunday morning has a huge following, and they love Leslie Stahl, who is a friend of mine, as she announced in the beginning of it, and finally said to me one day, how do you do this one book a year thing? And what's a writer's life like? You've had a big career in the law, and now you're in the game anyway, if not at the top, and with the books. So she asked to do it. It was going to be a 4-minute piece. It became an 8-minute piece. She flew up to Martha's Vineyard. She interviewed me with other writers, Nelson DeMille, Susan Isaacs, whom you know, and Harlan Coben, all big bestsellers.
The Living Mystery Writers Society.
Right, exactly. And came to my apartment. We couldn't get permission, actually, to film in the zoo, but we filmed over Bethesda Fountain in the park. And everywhere I went on book tour, people came saying, I've never read you before, but I saw you with Leslie Stahl. So huge breakout difference.
Now your book, Deadfall, your 19th novel. 19 novels, my God. Marty London just told me that he can't even write one. Now, what is the significance of the title Deadfall? But it does sound eerie.
Well, I was being toured through the Bronx Zoo, through the good graces of friends who you and I both know, who are on the board, and the fabulous young zookeeper, now in administration, was describing what we were going past. And
so did you have a book in mind when you took the tour?
Yes, I was doing endangered species animals. The zoo was very much a New York landmark I grew up with early in my own life and wanted to get to. And she was describing the fallen trees that some of the great gorillas were romping on. And she said, that's a deadfall. And I lit up because we're always looking for catchy titles in crime fiction. And actually, you know, a one-word strong title had dead in it, which I immediately liked. And it did mean trees, brush struck by lightning, falling, age. But in more significance, in the world of hunting, hunters create deadfalls.
A trap.
Traps, and they are meant to be traps for wild animals, and so we've all seen them going back to the Tarzan movies where the bad guys would dig a hole in the ground, cover them with dead branches, and the animals would be lured to the traps and fall in. So I loved the word, I thought it was strong, and I thought it was ominous.
Now, how do you go about writing your books? I mean, clearly you do research, you go to the zoo, if that's what you have in mind.
Right.
And then what do? You lock yourself in a room in Martha's Vineyard?
Or the city.
How does it work?
Locking myself in the room is key. I'm a very collegial person. I like to see you at Premola. I love my work with colleagues in the DA's office. Doors were never closed. As when you were U.S. attorney, you had people to think with and cover your back and brainstorm with when you went to court. Writing is solitary. And a good day is when I can close that door, tell my friends. By now, the friends have caught on. Books 1, 2, 3, it was always let's go to the beach or let's go shopping. Or this is really to get in the zone, as I call it. I want solitude. I want quiet. I want to have done enough research and plotted where I'm going, and then I want as many hours as I can carve out of a day to put pen to paper.
But when you come out of your room and go to Premola and have a Doers on the Rocks,
Yes.
That's research for your book. I mean, a couple of books ago, Alexandra Cooper, your heroine, gets kidnapped outside Premola.
Right outside the door. Who knew it was so dangerous?
Do you have that eerie feeling as you leave the restaurant looking around for an Uber driver
Every now and then.
out to get you?
Yes, every now and then I do. I mean, I think with writers, especially when you do continuing characters, everything is material. And you're always thinking in the heads of those characters. So when you're in a restaurant, it's a conversation you may pick up at another table. It's an interesting character who may appear. You don't hear anything, but you pick up a mode of acting or manner of dress. So yes, even dinners at a good restaurant are part of the research material.
Now, Alexandra Cooper, I mean, to steal a title from another book, gets younger each year, or younger next year. She seems to have aged only 3 years and 19.
Isn't that amazing?
Age cannot wither her.
Age can't wither her, and that's just one of the joys of the poetic license of writing fiction. She stays young and thin and blonde, and life goes on for me.
Acquires a detective as a boyfriend.
She now has moved that along. That tension started in about book 3, and in book 19, figured we had to do something about it.
What I've always found interesting is your book. It's kind of a roman à clef in the sense that you have real characters thinly disguised and real places not so thinly disguised. So in this book and other books, but this book particularly, you take us to the Echo part of Grand Central Terminal. You take us to restaurants you like. You toss down a Doers on the Rocks at Premola. You go to Central Park, and of course you have the Bronx Zoo. It's not all Manhattan. Do you find this is an effective convention in writing mystery novels?
Well, I did. I was looking for something when I started the first book that would be my own branding. And I love this genre, but I don't love books that are just action and shootouts and car chases. So I thought by sort of taking each book into a world that was some part of New York City history, it would entertain me the year that I'm working on it, and hopefully would entertain the readers. And my editor first scoffed and said, people in Kansas aren't going to care, people in New Zealand aren't going to care. And to the contrary, the nice response, everybody who's ever passed through New York, if they like mystery, seems to have some kind of enjoyment with a familiar place. And the mail
walks
I get,
up the steps to the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Right.
And,
watching their
but
back.
They don't know we see the New York County District Attorney assassinated.
Right. Well, some things have to come out of the imagination. But foreign readers will often say, I've never been to New York, I'm never going to get there, but that sense of place, which I got from Agatha Christie, which I got from Jean Le Carré, which I got from Tana French, who writes a fabulous mystery set in Dublin. That's what I want to give the reader by doing something that's actually grounded in New York.
Well, do you relate as well to some of the classic roman à clef, The Devil Wore Prada, or the Sylvia Plath Bell Jar, or Jay McInerney? Is that all part of this wonderfully delicious stew that you create in your novels?
Well, of course, I love to read, and I love other people's books. And Devil Wore Prada, I had great fun with as a book and as a movie. I've always admired McInerney's work, Bright Lights, Big City, from the early
Memoir of myself.
And I love to read him. Plath, and I majored in English, a little dark for me, as you can tell from my personality. Brilliant, but a little dark.
Let's take the beginning of Deadfall, which is so dramatic, and I won't give the book away, but the DA who is assassinated and falls in your arms, leaving his trail of blood around him, particularly on your dress, is called Paul Battaglia. Now, the New York County, in the book, New York County District Attorney for 3 decades, and someone who hired Alexandra out of law school, in fact, Virginia Law School.
Yes.
Many other similarities. You worked for Bob Morgenthau, and he was sort of all of those things to you. He hired you out of law school, and
no, Frank Hogan, not to
Frank
correct you.
Hogan
Frank
did.
Hogan did.
Okay.
I've had 3 DAs.
Okay,
Frank,
but he
and-
ratified the decision.
Yes, yes, he did, and
but still,
elevated me.
Still, many similarities to reality. I mean, is Paul Battaglia Bob Morgenthau?
No, of course not, because I would never. Bob is alive and well, which is a very good thing, with a very active mind and life. But I was looking for a way that my fictional DA in the last 3 books has blurred some lines, integrity. That's why I want no connection to Bob. And so I had a dilemma of how I either resurrect him, do something to get him back in good standing, or I had to lose him. And so I had the very painful choice to make, but dramatic, to lose him. And that, of course, turns Alex's world upside down because she was there and because Paul was there to see her. She becomes unwittingly a suspect. And what I was looking for was a device. In these books, you've got to evolve the characters, you've got to change things in the book to keep readers' attention in a series. I wanted to turn this around and make her the suspect, have her be in the seat where she's put so many people in her 12-year career as a prosecutor. So that was really the device to get me to that place.
But still determined throughout the book to find Battaglia's killer.
Absolutely.
And to vindicate her relationship with Battaglia, which is very interesting and very exciting. And I won't go into more of the details, except you wind up in the Bronx Zoo.
I do.
Now, what was your contact with the Bronx Zoo before you wrote the book?
I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, which is
so
right
did
next to the
Alexandra.
Bronx.
So did Alexandra.
Well, she was a little fancier. She's Harrison. She's northern Westchester. But I was 15 minutes from the zoo growing up. And if the kids in the neighborhood, if my friends and I were well behaved, one mother or another might take us every couple of months to the Bronx Zoo. So I grew up there when zoos were a very different place. Part of what I want to do in this book is expose the sad fact of endangered species animals and how they're trafficked globally. Parts of them are actually the animals themselves. And zoos, when I grew up, the lion house was about the size of this stage, and the lions would just pace back and forth in a cage. All that changed by the 70s, certainly in the Bronx Zoo and other good zoos that have become part of wonderful Wildlife Conservation Society efforts. Now there's the African plains, so the lions roam free. It looks pretty free to the person who's going around the zoo. There's hundreds of acres in the Bronx, which is why the city fathers, Teddy Roosevelt among them, chose the Bronx as the wilderness in which to set the city's first zoo. I got there for a variety of reasons, and the fact that Justice Scalia, by the way, died on a hunting preserve in Texas, was another fact that drew me into this wild world of hunting. I had no idea he was a hunter, and I had no idea he'd be on a preserve in Texas without his federal marshals.
Well, he had famously gone hunting with Dick Cheney, the vice president, when he had a case before him.
Yes.
But now, Teddy Roosevelt, another paradox, known as the great conservationist, and yet he was a big game hunter.
Yes. So that was one of the things that seemed so oxymoronic when I started to read the history of this field. And so many of the great hunters, trophy hunters like Teddy Roosevelt, became keenly aware that as they moved west and were killing buffalo and bison on the American plains, that unless something was done to conserve them as we move westward, we'd kill all of them. So it's, to me, richly ironic that many of the people who are conservationists are also trophy hunters. And I try and explore that in the book.
Now, the book also has a thrilling ride on the Skyfari in the Bronx Zoo. What's the Skyfari?
So the Skyfari existed in my childhood.
You went on it in your childhood?
Yes, absolutely. And if you think of a ski gondola, it used to rise up on these cranky old metal chains, and it would take you across a lot of the open area of the zoo and down. And it was sort of retired a couple of years ago, except in my fiction, when the monorail was built that goes around the zoo. The Skyfari was a little more exciting. It would sometimes break down mid-ride, and the gondola would swing from side to side. So it was always more perilous.
Just above the lion.
To me. Just above the lion. I didn't even go that far in the book. I actually had nights where I thought, I can't do that. I can't have her dangling over Tiger Mountain. No one will go there. So I had other kinds of suspense, but I loved the Skyfari as a kid. It's been retired, but its remains are still there.
The critics call you the queen of suspense. How does a mystery writer heighten suspense? What conventions and devices do you use?
Well, that's a really good question, Jim. And part of it comes from another lawyer who writes mysteries, who writes great ones, David Baldacci, who also went to UVA Law, wrote a stunning first book called
what did they
Absolute
teach
Power.
you there?
I know. The course in murder was heavy. David is a good friend and just burst onto the scene while he was practicing law with a book called Absolute Power about a president who was caught in flagrante everything.
Well, we've had presidents like that.
We've had them. And I'd written 3 books by then, and I was doing a program at UVA Law with David. And Justin, whom you knew well, my late husband, was with me. And he read all of David's books in advance of meeting him. And he said, you know what David does better than anybody, and certainly far better than you, is every book ends with a note of suspense. The old expression, you can't put it down. You just want to turn that next page and go. And Justin said to me, you're doing these, you're ending with a bon mot, you're ending with a detective clever line, occasionally there's suspense. There is such a difference between book 3 and book 4. And I think in Deadfall, you really see it. Most of the critics wrote about it. There's just a note of suspense, twists and turns, almost at the end of every chapter. It's hard to do. It's hard to do realistically without it being just a contrivance. But I channel David Baldacci, and I thank him, one of the stars of the suspense world.
So you build it really by ending a chapter with an unanswered question.
Yes.
And
yes.
Which the reader is very curious about.
Yes.
Now, your 19 mystery books have all involved a homicide. And you really were a sex crimes prosecutor. Did you prosecute homicide cases?
I did, and there were many Robert Chambers, the Preppy murder case, probably the most well-known. But what I have her do in the special victims units, I mean, almost all of the cases that Alex is in court with, this case she's trying to solve on the street, not in court and at the zoo, are cases that involve either sexual assault, domestic violence, serial criminal. So they are all really connected to the work that my colleagues and I did in the Special Victims Unit. And every now and then I go outside. I mean, the next book, she needs to get back into court. She's been off that game for too many books now.
If we could shift for a moment to sex crimes, they've been very much in the news lately, particularly the grand jury investigation of St. Paul's School. Do you see the landscape in sex crimes as having changed over the years since you first began to tackle this important problem?
Yes, it's changed in extraordinary ways. So I joined the office with Mr. Hogan in '72. Bob Morgenthau put me in charge of the newly created Sex Crimes Unit in '76. Our laws were archaic, as you and I have discussed. There was no such thing as DNA used forensically until '86, and then not allowed in our courts till '89. That revolutionized the way we were able to look at and handle cases. Nobody believed clergy sexual abuse. In the '70s, I can remember cases that would come to us 1, 2, 3 a year, and the solution was the church would move the alleged offender before we could investigate, and he'd be in Texas, and I'd have no subpoena power over papers or witnesses. And you see, obviously, what has sadly become of the fact that issue on a national level has become believed by everybody and addressed in courts and in the church. So with schools, it's much the same way. I mean, the boarding school issue has been around for a very long time. I mean, occasionally case on case of as a kid, student on student, as we've talked about earlier. But also it's just a very fertile ground for teachers, most of whom are good people. I'm not slandering, but it's also a community in which kids are away from home for the first time, vulnerable, young adolescents. And it's been a bad place for people who have bad motives to be in the community. And so,
is this because of coeducation that's made this more possible? Of course, I mean, you always had this in the English boarding schools.
Sure you did, and you had it in single-sex schools here,
Yeah.
both with male teachers and women teachers. So I think any of this that hits the light of day, I mean, once we can talk about it as a society, and once we begin to handle some of these cases, it was a similar thing to the church. These teachers, you look at some of the records, these teachers, St. George's, I think is the other one in Rhode Island, where the teachers just move from one school to another. And unlike licensing in most city schools, for example, in New York, you just need a recommendation. So if the dean of this school is just happy to get rid of John Doe because something hasn't been right about him, John's great. You'd be lucky to have him at your school.
Conspiracy of silence.
It's conspiracy.
So you had it at Choate as well, and at Exeter involving faculty members. But there's a tendency of an institution always to kind of cover up its mistakes?
Absolutely.
And not come out with it, and not to do something to rectify the problems.
That's traditionally a problem with just about every kind of institution I've ever dealt with.
Like
And of
Penn
course,
State.
Like Penn State, for sure. So, let's keep it inside. Let's keep it to ourselves. Let's solve the problem. No need to go to the police. We know how to correct this. We can let this guy go or this woman go. So it's become now, again, in the daylight, and a massive undertaking for both the institutions themselves and for law enforcement.
Well, so that approach won't work anymore, and I think a lot of these institutions have done a great deal of soul searching. They've come out with all sorts of revelations about things that occurred in the remote past.
Yes, yes.
But so do you see the situation is changing, and is it changing for the better?
Oh, yes, I think it's changing far for the better. I think parents and young adults going to these schools, teens and adolescents going to these schools, are much more aware that these issues have occurred. I think many more parents explore what the current climate at a school is. And I think the administration at every one of these schools is now keenly aware that this is not something to sweep under the carpet.
Is there a role for the criminal law here in these sometimes sad situations, as we've perhaps discussed in the past, with two students, both of them quite naive, or situations involving a faculty and misbehavior with a student?
Sure. I think there's a very definite role, and there has to be an aggressive role by law enforcement to understand, to learn how to handle these cases, how to investigate them. Once you use the word, in my view, rape or sexual assault, not college regs or the school regs that Susie went to a room on the 10th floor that she wasn't supposed to go to, that's a punishment, and she can be kept out of gym for 5 days. I mean, if you use words that involve the commission of a crime, then law enforcement has to be involved. And I think that's been the gap. The school's long saying, most schools, we'll do this ourselves, we'll keep this quiet, we'll keep it under wraps. It just doesn't work. And now we see, I think all of us who have done this work, see women and men who 20 years ago, 30 years ago were violated, who many of whom recover, many of whom have talked about it and helped, but many of whom carry a significant amount of emotional damage with them because no one believed them 20 years ago. No one cared 20 years ago. There was no effort to get justice. So I think we have a lot of work to do.
A lot of work to do. Well, I have a question for you, Linda
Yes.
Fairstein. We've come to the end very sadly. It always goes fast when you're having a good time. But my question is, what's next for Alexandra Cooper?
Okay.
And please don't kill her.
No, I'm so attached to her for personal reasons that I'm hoping to keep her alive and well. I've been introduced to a wonderful, wonderful place in New York City that I think many New Yorkers have been by and around, but never in the campus. So Rockefeller Institute, the great Rockefeller Institute, Rockefeller University on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, an exquisite campus. When John Rockefeller in 1901 lost one of his grandsons to scarlet fever, he said, I've got more money than anyone in the world, I can cure this. So there's a small hospital, a 30-bed infectious disease hospital on this campus, which I didn't know about. There are underground tunnels. Fortunately, the security guards are former NYPD cops. They're happy to take me underground and around the campus. And Alex is going to be involved in something that has to do with the medical world.
Something to do with the medical world. Linda Fairstein, thank you so much for coming by.
Always great to talk.
This has been just wonderful. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.